Welcome to GlobalPolicyCast, a podcast which opens the inner workings of international governance through conversations with those who have shaped policy from insight to impact. Hosted by Insights International with its co-founder Arpit Chaturvedi and Suresh Kumar, a career civil servant with nearly 40 years of implementing policy on the ground. Global ideas, real governance. Welcome to Global Policy.
One related query and related observations, Dr. Shapiro. You said the most courts in USA have remain conservative and they remain within.
Except for the Warren Court, yeah.
But what do you think? What's your take? Should the courts remain conservative, or the kind of judicial activism, judicial overreach we see in India, we experience day in, day out? Some call it because it's happening due to executive failing. Some call it because of lethargy or unresponsive attitude or conduct of the legislatures. Whatever may be the reason, should judicial activism be tolerated in democratic governance?
No, I think it's usually counterproductive because, especially on divisive issues, if courts become activists, they undermine their own legitimacy. So we saw this in the US with things like abortion, the 1973, the versus Wade decision. The court said, we're going to settle this divisive question for all time. And all it did was pour gasoline on it because the country was divided. And, when the country is divided, having the court take one side, the other side is going to be furious. And I think the battles over affirmative action have been comparable, deeply divisive issues. Thinking you can take them out of politics by having the court settle them, I think is a fool's errand.
But I would add, at least in India's context, and I don't know, Mr. Kumar, what you think about it. I feel that the argument to rein in the courts is going to create more of authoritarianism in the system, because right now in India, Dr. Shapiro, there's this debate going on that in the Supreme Court, it is the collegium, which is the judges appointing judges. And there's this whole movement going on that we should have a more transparent system for the appointment of judges with, legislative incursions and influence into that system. And I feel that as flawed as, the current judicial system would be in India, we need to preserve it, because if we don't, then all of that power again coagulates into the executive, which breeds more authoritarianism. It's not going to the legislature at all.
Arpit, yes, you're not totally wrong. But at the same time, let's not forget that if the courts, I agree with Dr. Shapiro, if the courts do go beyond their brief, beyond their defined kind of mandate, probably they will lose their legitimacy, and as a result, there'll be more chaos. Yes, executive may fail, but the corrections have to be made by the executive themselves. The oversight has to remain with the legislature, not with the court going beyond. Because once they do that, what happens is, and what I keep saying it, this kind of a judicial activism, the kind we're seeing in India, or judicial overreach which we are seeing in India, causes a lot of what I call as a litigation terror. This litigation terror impairs the government. It kind of, particularly the civil services, the bureaucracy, they feel terrified with the judicial interventions which are beyond their brief, something which should have been done as part of award and punishment system of the executive or oversight by the legislature. If the courts start doing it, then there is no remedy left for even the civil servants, even the elected political representatives, or for the common man. Therefore, courts have to remain conservative within the defined constitutional limits and not go beyond something which remains in the domain of policy making or in the domain of rule making or law making. Law making is with the legislature, and policy making should remain with the policymakers or the political executives. Unfortunately, the role of policy making is being taken over, or even some matters, the role of legislative enactments is being done by judiciary by the judicial courts in India, and that's very dangerous.
I would still argue that it is the legislature and the executive that also does a fair bit of overreach. So I think it's a reaction to that as well. But looking forward to hear what
the legislative overreach or executive overreach can be contained by the judicial action or judicial orders or judicial intervention. But
Yes.
what happens if the judiciary also goes beyond their mandate, beyond their defined limits? That's where the problem comes. If executive is doing something wrong, which is beyond their brief, beyond their constitutional mandate, or beyond the law, executive can be hauled up by the court. That's the process of judicial review. But the unfortunate situation is whether through the instruments of public interest litigation, through the philosophical innovations of the concept of human rights, basic rights, you have to secure basic rights, human rights, but you cannot go beyond the defined parameters, defined provisions of law and the constitution. That's where the problem of judicial overreach comes in. Dr. Shapiro.
Yeah.
So,
No, I don't dissent from that. I think the kind of idea of turning to the courts for politics is in many ways comparable to turning over power to bureaucrats. If there are deep divisions and deep conflicts in the society, you can't make them go away by handing power to an individual or a group that's just going to impose one side view of the matter onto others. I think you have to find a way of channeling the disagreements into the political system and have compromises hammered out. Or policies, as I said, often trial and error, but governments make essentially bets on a certain set of policies, and if they work, they'll be rewarded, and if they don't, they won't be rewarded. I think that it's a conceit, it's a fantasy to think, well, let the courts settle this, or let you know you're just papering over what has to be dealt with. And so I think you do have to understand the basic underlying sources of conflict in the society and think about ways to address them. And unless and until you do that, all these other things are band-aids and indeed sometimes make the problem worse.
absolutely. I am, now just shifting gears a little bit, and I want to discuss your research on the single issue voters. You did some research on that, on Brexit and how does it impact political parties. It leads to party realignment. And I feel that with social media, there's a lot of single issue voters. I don't know if you also draw that link from social media, but I feel that that's one thing. But what do you think about how are voters, converging in many places and in many instances on just being this single issue voter and not caring about all of the other things that could be impacting their lives?
Well, I think political elites have facilitated that by doing more and more through referendums and, as we call them in the US, ballot initiatives. So, because they are magnets for single issue voters who care intensely about one thing, but never discount the impact that thing they can care about will have on others' things. I mean, just so for example, if you ask American voters, should we get rid of a tax, any tax, you'll get big majorities to say yes. Even the estate tax that almost nobody pays, only the very rich pay it. You say, should we get rid of the estate tax? A majority will say yes. But if you say to them, should we get rid of the estate tax if it also means getting rid of free prescription drugs for senior citizens, then they'll say no. In the second example, they're being forced to discount their preference for getting rid of the tax with their preference for keeping the free prescription drug benefits. That's what parties do. They bundle issues together into platforms, and they discount everything they propose by everything else they propose in a way that they think will appeal to large numbers of voters. That's what parties are for, significant part. So if you now come along with a referendum that pulls something out of that bundle
Yeah.
to empower the particular voters who care about that single issue, who maybe don't care about the knock-on effects of that issue for everything else in the country. Brexit was a classic example of this because, the choice presented to voters in Brexit was completely artificial in the sense that there was no alternative presented as, well, if we're not in the European Union, what will we be? There were some people on the right wing of the Conservative Party and Farage's people, they wanted Britain to be sort of Singapore on the Thames. And then there were people on the left wing of the Labour Party who wanted it to be socialism in one country, right? And so this became, the smoking gun for this was in 2017 when Theresa May was trying to implement Brexit. What did she find? There was a majority in Parliament against what she had negotiated as the departure agreement. There was a majority in Parliament against every other proposal that had been put forward as an alternative. And there was a majority in Parliament against having another referendum. That tells you that should we leave or not leave was a completely absurd question to ask, because leave for what? For where? And there was a reason most 2/3 of the Parliamentary Labour Party and 2/3 of the Parliamentary Conservative Party were against leaving the European Union, because they knew it would be very bad for the constituents in their constituencies. And that's because half of Britain's trade is with Europe. And all the small businesses were going to be decimated by this. And they were going to be governed by trade rules that they had even less control over than they had by being in the European Union. So the politicians understood that, because the party politicians, they typically bundle all these issues. People may not like bureaucrats in Brussels.
Is that a new innovation, or?
Britain's first referendum was in 1975 on the European Union. It was Harold Wilson. He had a conflict within the Labour Party about, Edward Heath had taken them in 4 years earlier without a referendum. Britain had never had a referendum. And Wilson didn't want to confront the fight within his party over membership in the EU. So I called a referendum at which went 2/3 to remain in the EU. By the way, it didn't stop the fight anyway, because the left wing of the Labour Party was against it, Foot and that lot. And eventually the party split, and Shirley Williams and a bunch of other people left and formed the Social Democrats. So it didn't work anyway. But the turn to referendum politics is a recent one, and Britain's famous for the doctrine of the sovereignty of Parliament. And once you do that, you turn to referendum politics, it's just another nail in the coffin of strong parliamentary politics.
Absolutely. My last question before I hand it over to Mr. Kumar is, what are your reflections on, because when you were talking about Britain, I was also thinking about the Liberal Party over there and how it got decimated later on. But I'm thinking that globally, with the polarization increasing, do you think that the parties or the subgroups within the parties that were taking more of a centrist stance are getting diluted? And do you think that's probably a good thing, as you earlier said, that because these were the folks who had sort of subscribed to the neoliberal or Washington consensus, so they had to go anyway? Or what explains this, evaporation of the centrist mindset over there?
Oh, I think it's because the centrist parties bought into the neoliberal consensus and the Washington consensus. And bet on it and believe the Thatcher line, there is no alternative. Unlike in the 90s, why did business elites in the US support the New Deal? Significant numbers of them, not all of them, but significant numbers of them supported it because there was a communist alternative out there competing for the hearts and minds of American workers. They were very powerful within the trade unions in the US. And so the elites really, the sort of Averell Harrimans of this world, they recognized that we better make sure that the American worker doesn't believe they have nothing to lose but their chains. And that's partly why they supported the welfare state. And in Britain, in the 60s and 60s, you had people like Ralph Miliband, who's the father of the Ed Miliband. Ralph Miliband wrote a book. He said the welfare state is capitalism's best friend because it stops the working class from becoming militant. And so, you know, you had this buy-in. And I think after the collapse of communist economic models, the elites became complacent. They said, you know, we don't have to worry about this problem anyway. These people have no place to go. Well, it turns out they do have places to go.
So your policy, like on economic policy, thinking is that should we think of a new economics altogether, or should we go back to a bit of Keynesianism, or what do you think?
Well, I think it's got to be philosophically inspired by the Keynesian impulse, but no, they won't be it's not going to be the UPA of the 1930s. It's going to be an industrial policy for the world we live in today. It's going to have to take active public management. It's going to have to take active collaboration between the public sector and the business sector. And it's going to have to be highly experimental. Things will fail, but you know, the world has more imagination than policymakers, and they have to engage, see what works. I don't think we shouldn't, this is a pretty depressing conversation, you might say, but imagine it was 1946 in Europe, and you were somebody who had been born in 1900. You were 46 years old, the end of World War II, in any European country. And somebody said, how does the future look? Imagine what your life had been like. You'd grown up, you'd grown up in the Depression, two world wars, the rise of fascism. You know, if you said, oh, we're on the verge of, 5 decades of the most astonishing inclusive growth the world has ever seen, people would have sent you to a mental hospital. Life has more imagination than us. And I think even though there's no blueprint for what to do, it's what is obvious is what the questions are that have to be.